he wrote to Buckley or somebody that there may be a reason the three great religions converge in that part of the world, because they need it more than anybody else.
Let's talk about one other side of the policy questions in the Reagan years, the foreign policy. Reagan was, in your book, you tend to present him as a kind of idealist in foreign policy terms, an enemy of the détente that President Ford and Henry Kissinger, as his Secretary of State, had engineered, a critic of the realism without sort of soaring moral goals that they proclaimed, that Kissinger in particular proclaimed. How do you stick to that evaluation of him? Is he basically an idealist, or is he a kind of realist? I mean, how do you look back at the Reagan doctrine and at his foreign policy?
I think he had the ideal combination, or near ideal combination, assuming there is one, between idealism and realism. It's really interesting to go back to 1976 and his statements about détente, about human rights, and about wanting to abolish nuclear weapons. Oh, and I'll add a fourth one that's about domestic policy, and about Washington, D.C. as this insider's place. They were indistinguishable from what Governor Jimmy Carter was saying in his campaign. You can lay them side by side, you can't tell them apart. The difference, of course, I think, is in execution. Carter was wholly an idealist, and that led him in his human rights crusade essentially to punish America's allies who were imperfect. Reagan understood that while you hold up idealism as your goal, and do use that to influence governments to reform, whether it's the Philippines, Argentina, and so forth, you don't want to go so far as to destabilize those countries. His administration had much more prudence about that, right? Unlike Carter's.
This was dictatorships and double standards.
Exactly.
Gene Kirkpatrick's famous.
Oh, he took to
piece.
that article like a fish to water when he read that, right? It's a famous story. Among many of the famous stories is that one. So yeah, I think but he was very much realistic in understanding the limits of American power, that American persuasion alone was not sufficient to carry the day, or could backfire if you destabilize, as I say, an imperfect country that's nonetheless friendly to us. Right. And I think he understood something Carter's people never understood, such as with Nicaragua, that if you destabilize a country, the cause of human rights will actually be set back. That certainly was true in Iran and Nicaragua and other countries that went from authoritarian regimes that were unlovely to communist dictatorships, right? So he understood that. In other words, he was more of a consequentialist, in an Aristotelian way, whereas I think Carter was a pure Kantian idealist. If we're just all, sunshines and puppy dogs, the world will turn out right.
Well, Reagan could also be a kind of, as you say, sort of Aristotelian, and he has principled goals, but he's flexible in his means to those goals. But given that, what would he think of later Republican foreign policy in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Middle East more generally, do you think?
That's a really good question. He often professed in his diaries and in letters to be baffled by the Middle East. I think he wrote to Buckley or somebody that there may be a reason the three great religions converge in that part of the world, because they need it more than anybody else. And the experience of Lebanon was a very bitter one. Thought that was the biggest foreign policy mistake he made, was committing really not enough troops and under restrictive rules of engagement for something that was open-ended and hard to see how it was going to work out well.
They were there to enforce a ceasefire,
right,
in Lebanon, right?
Right. Between
doesn't sound like a great idea when you
right
on the surface.
He is also, I'll add this about Reagan, he was very force-averse. He had the reputation coming in as well, this dangerous cowboy might push the button. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, he always said, never say never, and he did say, good thing to keep our enemies guessing, like Nicaragua. On the other hand, I think the Nicaragua case is especially important. His liberal critics would say, Reagan's not going to be happy until American Marines are in Nicaragua. And Reagan from day one said, I'm not sending a single American troop in Nicaragua. But he wouldn't say that publicly, because he wanted the Nicaraguans to worry about it, right? And he wanted the Cubans to worry about it. He was perfectly willing to support the Contras and proxy forces pretty vigorously, and of course it was a big fight. But And then in his last year in office, we had Panama. And his whole team said, you know, we got to take out Noriega in Panama. He's a bad guy, et cetera. And Reagan refused. And essentially said, let George do it. I mean, so, you know, let my success, I'm not going to do it. And partly it was aversion to force. And so he was much more cautious than the reputation would have you suggest. So I think, who knows, but I think a case can be made that he would have been very skeptical about our Iraq strategy and policy and commitment, and maybe Afghanistan too, at least lasting this long. And part of those are reasons not just of being averse to use of force, but also I think there was the realism about, can you actually plant democracy with, some things he used to say about Vietnam in the 60s were, what a crazy strategy, we're trying to make this into a, you know, another New Deal Great Society venue. So that's dumb. If we're going to fight a war, let's fight a war or not do it at all. So,
but he was interested in freeing the captive peoples held captive by the Soviet Union, and in helping to build institutions of a free society and sponsor, you know, events that would eventually lead to demonstrations, uprisings, and sort of the peoples held captive asserting themselves,
right,
which helped to contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union. Does that side of him, what lesson do you draw from that vis-a-vis Iraq and Afghanistan and such adventures?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's Reagan, I never quite put it this way that I'm aware of, but I think he understood there has to be a desire and a capacity on the part of the peoples you want to liberate to be liberated. Show some initiative. As early as, at least as early as 1979, but I think earlier, 79 I pick on because that's when John Paul becomes Pope. And he thinks this is very significant, as does the KGB, right? And he's seeing the restiveness in Eastern Europe, and he's getting the intelligence reports that these people would like to throw communism off. He did say, and this is another important point about Reagan, is he did say in the 70s what Churchill said way back in 1920, that communism is unnatural. It goes against human nature. This is a wrong way to govern people, and it can't last. That's very different from your Nixons and Kissingers and other realists, even a lot of neoconservatives like Norman Podhoretz, who thought the Soviet Union is here for the long haul. We've got to figure out how to get along with them and deal with them. And Reagan thought, no, this is unnatural. Well, I think the obvious contrast is you do not see the equivalent of Pope John Paul II in the Islamic world, right? And without some kind of indication of that in some cultural and social way, in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think he'd be deeply capable that we could tip the scales.
Right. Or Lech Walesa or something like that.
Right. There's no comparable figure to Sakharov in, I know Charles Krauthammer, who has said, where is the Andrei Sakharov of the Palestinian world? And there isn't such a person.
Right.